Afternoon and good morning, perhaps, to some of you, but welcome to our talk today. It's my pleasure to welcome Margaret Cormack to our seminar series. Margaret is Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at the College of Charleston, South Carolina, and currently a guest researcher at the Árni Magnússon Institute for Icelandic Studies in Reykjavik. Her research focuses on the history of religion and cultural history in Scandinavia, particularly the cult of saints. She's the author of The Saints in Iceland from their veneration. Their veneration from the conversion to 1400, and another book, The Saga of John of Holla, and numerous other books, book chapters, and articles. Today, she'll speak to us about the cult of Saint Clement in Iceland. Margaret, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I was greatly honored to be invited to give a talk in this August series of talks. I feel like saying, and now for something completely different, but hearing that you were in fact working in the 12th century, that makes it not so very different. So let me begin by sharing my screen. Okay. Okay, now as Dan can, okay, sure, wait a minute. We did this before, and now I need to find the one. Where is the one that is for the presentation mode?
In the bottom right, next to the slider for Zoom, I think.
Ah,
that one.
Yes. Yes, okay. Okay, so this is just to get you to the far west and north of the Christian world in the 12th century. And what you see on this map should be, I'm a little bit worried that, sorry, I'm a little bit worried that, at least on my screen, Hamburg-Bremen's sort of fallen off the bottom. But what you should see is a dot for Hamburg-Bremen down under England somewhere, Lund up off to the right, then a dot in Norway, in sort of the middle of Norway, that is Trondheim or Nidaros, and those are the successive arch seas under which Iceland was at various times. And there you see Iceland with its two cathedrals. So that's your geographical orientation. And for a historic orientation, I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. I'm not going to read it absolutely right off, but you can be reading it as I go along. So aside from some possible Irish hermits, whose ethnicity is deduced by the items they left behind, bells, books, and croziers, Iceland was settled from Scandinavia, though with a significant input of settlers from the northern British Isles and Ireland around about the year 870. Some of those settlers, primarily the ones from Britain and Ireland, would have been Christian already, and the religion would have been known to many others, even those who practiced the religion they brought from Scandinavia, knowledge of which is in fact best preserved in Icelandic sources, but that's another lecture. There was no executive authority in Iceland, but there was a national assembly which was responsible for legal decisions, and it was decided there in the year 999 that everyone should be baptized. Presumably, this was due to pressure from the Christian king of Norway. Now, at this time, Scandinavia was under the Diocese of Hamburg-Bremen. Before that date, only one bishop from Germany had visited Iceland. After it, a number of foreign bishops were active, including one from Ireland, some possibly from Armenia, and a number from England and Germany. In 1054, an Icelander was consecrated bishop of the entire country. He had studied in Hereford in Germany, as did his son and successor, and their family estate of Skalholt became the first cathedral of all Iceland, although about 50 years later, a second cathedral, a second diocese was formed in the north. At about the same time, there was also a revision of the greater geography, and instead of being subordinate to Hamburg-Bremen, now the Archdiocese of Iceland was in Lund, in what was then Denmark, but is now Sweden. Shortly after that, in 1122 to 33, the Icelandic bishops, in consultation with the archbishop and various other learned men, composed what is called the Christian law, or the Christian law section for the island. Among other things, it states that only priests who use Latin were allowed to perform sacraments. You could listen, they could baptize, but then anybody could do an emergency baptism. But unless you spoke Latin, you had no status as a priest. This law contains really basic instructions on the practice of Christianity, the duties of priests and laymen, care of churches, and feasts and fasts to be observed. In particular, a list describing the observance of feasts by the laity, in modern terms, holy days of obligation, is our first source of information about the saints who were venerated in Iceland, and Clement was among them. The list was subsequently modified, for example, to incorporate the two Icelandic saints, Thorlákur and Jón, who were locally canonized at the end of the 12th century. I should add that the country was entirely rural. There were no concentrations of population that could classify even as villages on international standards, except possibly at the two dioceses. And churches were proprietary churches, Eigenkirchen, run by the people who built them, who often themselves became priests. It appears that it was popular for chieftains to have one of their sons taught for holy orders to become a priest, but this did not prevent him from continuing his traditional secular duties as a chieftain. So you have these priest chieftains who are to become anathema later on. All this changes towards the end of the 12th century and through to the second half of the 13th century. But again, that is way beyond the scope of this talk. Now, the Christian law, which I just mentioned, required every church to keep and to read out in public annually a contract called a máldagi, which listed its possessions, gifts it received, masses it was required to celebrate, charities it must administer, and so on and so forth. How many priests had to live on the estate, if any? Some didn't have any, some were just churches without a priest. Others had more than one priest. Now, most of these máldagar survive only in copies, and sometimes in copies of copies. The earliest texts that we can actually determine from those later copies are usually from the 14th century. Rarely do they contain precise dates. However, they do provide our primary evidence for the cult of saints in Iceland, and the book that Maria mentioned is basically analysis of the content of those máldagar up to 1400. As I mentioned, there's a new archdiocese that comes along in 1152 and 53, which includes Iceland, Greenland, Orkney, and the Hebrides. And in 1262 to 4, Icelanders decide to become subordinate to the Norwegian king. And they now actually have a king, which they did not have before. Okay, now to the subject of my talk that I was asked to present. St. Clement of Rome, as I'm sure you know, was the third successor to St. Peter after Linus and Anacletus. And all of this is listed in the Icelandic annals that were composed in the 13th century. They knew perfectly well what was going on. However, Clement was often also thought to be Peter's immediate successor, concentrated and installed by the Apostle Peter himself. So there are these two different traditions. His cult will have arrived in Iceland along with Christianity from neighboring lands. Analysis of that cult began with Eric Cynthio, who in 1968 published a study of the churches of St. Clement in Scandinavia. And all of these references, by the way, are collected in a bibliography in my final slide, so don't worry. It was followed 30 years later by Dietrich Hoffmann's Die Legende von St. Clemens in den skandinavischen Ländern im Mittelalter. Hoffmann includes this map, which does not come particularly well through on the screen, but as you can see, there are a lot of churches dedicated to St. Clement down here in Denmark, fair number in England, sort of 3 or 4 up the Norwegian coast, and he identifies 3 in Iceland. I can add a little bit to that, although not more churches. The work of those 2 men is summarized by Barbara Crawford, who is actually writing about the churches dedicated to St. Clement in medieval England, but her work includes a nice summary of both Cynthia and Hoffmann, and a discussion of what groups might have venerated St. Clement, and therefore what groups his dedications might represent. Seafarers and merchants and royalty have been suggested, and Crawford points out, however, that saints served a variety of clienteles and warns us that, quote, "It is wise to avoid too many hard and fast definitions about churches in circumstances where little documentary evidence survives to give us concrete information," end of quote. Lack of concrete information is precisely the situation in Iceland. I'm going to show you, let me see. Okay, there's the map, just to give you a general idea. And here are the details, and then we'll go back to the map. So according to the Maldaga, the first 3 items are the ones that Hoffmann had. There is a church dedicated to Saint Clement at Hoth in Órivie. It also owns a statue of him. A church dedicated to him at Kirkjubæjar in the Westman Islands, and a church dedicated to him along with the Virgin Mary and Apostle Peter at Akrar in Mýrar. He is also a patron, along with a number of other saints, of the southern altar of Viðey Monastery. There is an image, and again, along with many other images, in Kirkjubæjar Convent, and a saga along with other sagas at the church at Hruni in Hrunamannahreppur. And there you can see where those locations are. So off here is Hoth in Órivie. There are the Westman Islands. There is the church at Akrar, monastery at Viðey, Hruni, where the saga was, and Kirkjubæjar Cloister, where the statue was. And Hruni, as I said, also had some kind of statue or image of him. Now, this rather minimal presence could conceal a somewhat wider interest in St. Clement. It should be noted that his feast on November 23 was what we would call a holy day of obligation. Its observance was required throughout Iceland according to the Christian laws composed in 1122 to 33, so that people were likely to know about him, especially if they were able to attend church regularly. Now, in rural Iceland, you might not be able to attend church at all regularly. The nearest church could be very far away, but that's another issue. His story might have been better known than indicated by that single saga recorded at Hruni. Not all Maldaga listed their books by title, and additional copies may have been in circulation. Hruni is, in fact, located quite close to the Cathedral of Skalholt, which could account for the numerous books it owned. It was also a large church with 2 resident priests and a deacon, and those clergy would have provided masses for other churches in the vicinity. The dozen or so monasteries and convents in medieval Iceland had good Latin libraries, which contained Saints Vitae and Passiones, undoubtedly including that of Clement. So he could have been better known than this scattering of churches indicates. In spite of Crawford's cautions about determining the motives behind church dedications, the distribution of churches dedicated to Clement does seem to support the claim that Icelanders thought of him as patron of seafarers. It can be said that most of the inhabited areas of Iceland are in fact along the seacoast, but here you have Hruni inland. Kirkjubæur is really relatively close to the sea, but all of these other places seem to be very much associated with water. We need to bear in mind that there are other saints called on for aid at sea. The Virgin Mary is one. Saint Nicholas is another very well-known one, and one who is very, very popular in Iceland. And the three churches on the Westman Islands, so those are the Westman Islands, this is the main island, and the three churches are all there on that main island. The most important one is Nicholas, and that seems to be the first church on that island. And it provides the services to the other churches, to St. Mary and St. Clement's, so indicating that the islanders were really concerned with the sea, I think. Okay, so I'll just leave that slide on for a minute and say that the presence of Clement's cult in Iceland is indicated not only by its inclusion in the law code, but by the fact that Clement as a baptismal name is attested 3 times already in the 12th century. And that is quite early. There are a couple of apostle names. So John comes in I think, the 11th century, but there are some saints who don't show up until much, much later. It is striking, however, that only 2 churches, one of which was dedicated to him, and 1 convent owned images of the saint. While dedications were controlled by bishops, anyone, priest or not, could present a church with a statue or painting of the saint to whom they might be devoted. And in my opinion, the number of statues is actually often a far better indication of the popularity of a saint among the general population than the number of dedications. And here, alas, Clement is not particularly well represented. There are lots of saints who appear later in the Middle Ages, especially many of the female saints. St. Catherine is one of them, known to have appeared sort of around 1200 on the Icelandic radar screen. And there are lots and lots of statues of those saints, and very few for Clement. Okay, so this group I know is primarily concerned with texts. And I wish I could promise you a lot of wonderful Latin texts that could be analyzed. Alas, what survives from Iceland is probably 98% vernacular texts. The Latin ones, if they were liturgical texts, they were done away with at the Reformation. They were turned into shoe leather or this, that, and the other. And even texts on sort of, historical subjects that were not necessarily religiously incorrect were for whatever reason not kept. So very few Latin texts have survived at all. But we do have vernacular sagas. Now, saga just means story, a vernacular prose narrative, and stories about saints were translated from Latin into the common language of Norway and Iceland beginning in the 12th century, even though no manuscripts have survived from that time. The surviving sagas of saints and of others were preserved and for the most part composed in Iceland in later centuries. The earliest ones from the 12th century or thereabouts were usually straightforward vernacular versions of Latin texts, perhaps abbreviated a bit, but in a style that would have been easily understood. That period also saw translations of basic grammatical, computistical, and historical texts such as a history of the Romans, Rómverja saga, into Icelandic from Latin. Historical works about Troy and Britain were also translated. And again, none of the Latin originals that they were translated from have survived. Although the church Moldager often tell us about lots and lots and lots of really interesting Latin texts that once existed, but now are gone. So we can never find out the exact exemplar that was translated into Icelandic, which we would really love to do, but it's just not possible. We must hunt through foreign catalogs and publications and digital encyclopedias to see what else might be out there. So the 12th century, as I said, featured fairly straightforward translations. But the 13th, when people are becoming familiar with these saints, and even more in the 14th, the translators tended to use a much more ornate, sort of Latinate style of narrative. And revisions and translations were added to many existing saint sagas. Some sagas exist in several versions, each suited to the specific audience and political circumstances at the time of writing. These texts were presumably produced and read in monasteries and convents. We must not forget that not all monks and nuns were really good at Latin, but they were also read in churches where the saints they described were venerated. We are in fact told that the saga of the Archangel Michael was written specifically for the purpose of being read in parish churches, especially those where he was a patron saint. So, turning to the sagas, for what follows, I rely pretty much exclusively on Hoffman's study, and he meticulously examined both the saga texts and the medieval and pre-medieval Latin and Greek texts, which might somehow have been used or contributed as sources at one or more removes from Clement's saga. I will tell you right now that, alas, no, there were no Greek texts that were used, that it all was from Latin. Now, the oldest manuscript, the oldest manuscript containing material about Clement is this one, AM 655, 18A quarto, written about 1250 to 1300. And this is an abridged version of an abridged translation of a Latin passio. Okay. It appears to have been written much earlier, written possibly in the 11th century, and it was used both by this next one, AM 645, but also by sagas about St. Peter, because of course St. Peter and Clement are very closely related to each other. And I had thought of trying to outline those relationships, but decided that it was probably not a good idea. And I will just say that we have these two versions of Clement's, two manuscripts only actually with Clement's material, two versions of sagas about St. Peter in far more manuscripts. And there seems to have been a lot of borrowing back and forth. Each tradition borrows from earlier writings in the other tradition. Those interrelationships are very complex, and I will not try to summarize what Hoffman says, although, as I say, he seems to have studied it very carefully and has probably gotten it right. So the text, which I will now refer to simply as Clement's saga, is found in AM 645 quarto, which is in fact one of the earliest manuscripts to survive in Iceland, written around 1210 to 1250. It contains sagas of various other saints than Clement, mostly apostles, but also including, and in fact beginning with, Saint Thorlákur, the #1 Icelandic saint who was locally canonized in 1198. Now, Clement's saga itself begins with this rather surprising paragraph. The first emperor of all the world was called Julius, and all kings of Rome have still taken the name from him, and so on and so forth. We eventually get to Augustus, and Augustus makes sense because Christ is born in the reign of Augustus, and so on and so forth. This material all comes from that Rómverja saga, which I mentioned to you. And those of you who are good at Roman history may be looking askance at some of the family relationships in this paragraph, and well, you should. Whether in the Latin or in Rómverja saga or by the author of Clement saga, a few things have gotten a little bit mixed up. But never mind that. What Hoffman suggests, and I absolutely agree with him, is that an Icelandic author could not resist the chance of creating a little noble genealogy to add on to the front of his saga. Okay, the main part of the saga is from the recogniciones of pseudo Abdias, probably not immediately, but through a vita by Johannes Diaconas Himonides and Bishop Gaudericus of Velletri. If any of you are familiar with this text, you know that somebody called Leo then adds on yet more information, but Hoffman considers that that is not the version that was available to the Icelandic author. Okay, and this, of course, by the way, is also incomplete, does not have the absolute end. Now, the author, and some of you may be wondering my use of the term author for somebody who is, cutting and pasting and doing this and that. But I think it's justified in the present case because he has his various sources. He does have the Latin behind the Passio. I don't think he has any Latin behind Rómverja saga, but he has Latin text as well as Icelandic text, and he checks them against each other, chooses what he likes, and puts it down, not necessarily in the same order as in the Latin quote unquote originals. And here the catch is, and that's why I was so interested in that new saga that has just been published. We can't know what other Latin sagas may have been out there. Hoffman thinks surely the only reason we can have such a rather strange saga about St. Clement is because there must have been oral traditions going around about him. Now, Icelanders love talking about oral traditions. I'm always a little bit skeptical because the oral traditions are very hard to pin down. And my feeling is that we shouldn't really talk about oral traditions until we can exclude all possible written traditions. And for somebody like Clement, there must have been so much written material out there that we just need to use caution in saying what the sources may have been. As I said, Hoffman read everything that was available to him in what looks like the 1980s, early 1990s. But the internet had not really gotten going at that time. So he has these various sources. The end is missing. Everywhere the end is missing. So for those of you who know the story, Clement is, so after these recogniciones, which are sort of like a Greek novel, in which, in this case, a family, in other cases, it's a pair of lovers, are separated, undergo all kinds of harrowing experiences, and finally get together again and recognize each other by the end of the story. And this is what happens to Clement and his family. So they all get together, under the auspices of Saint Peter himself. And indeed, we are told in this saga that St. Peter himself installs Clement as his successor and ordains him as the next pope. The next sentence after that says, briefly refers to the death of St. Peter and says that he was succeeded by Linus and then Anacletus and then Clemens. So we have these two completely contradicting stories back to back with each other. When the saga deals with the material contained in the translated Passio, again, he makes use of the translation. He's obviously got a little bit more Latin, and he sometimes puts stuff in from that, and sometimes he just seems to kind of, change things around, maybe off his own bat, though it's hard to tell. So anyway, I hope I have given you a taste and interest in this fascinating piece of hagiography. There is your bibliography. The Life of Clement, translated by Helen Karen, can be downloaded from the Viking Society for Northern Research Publications. Hoffman has an amazing, beautifully annotated. I mean, 2/3 of the page is the translation, and the remaining third is footnotes explaining what's going on. So I encourage everybody here to please read those sagas, and if there's anything that is paralleled in material that you are familiar with, that is not generally known, please get in touch with me, and maybe we can do some more work on the background of Clement's saga. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Margaret. That was a wonderful paper. As you can see, there's. I'll wait for the class to subside for a bit.
Well, I figured I would stop sooner rather than later, because I wouldn't know what questions people would want to have answered.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure there are loads of questions. I know Dan. Dan, should I start with you? I also have. I'm going to ask the first question, then I'm gonna give it over to Dan. You mentioned loads of that these churches had images as well as statues, and I was wondering what kind of images were they? Wall paintings? Were they narrative scenes? Were they standalone?
Okay, so first of all, there's a linguistic issue, because there are two words. There's a word that clearly means statue, and then there's another word, script, which in the editions I was using, the assumption was that a script was some kind of a painting. Now, it could maybe just be a two-dimensional wooden painting. We don't hear about actual wall paintings, and that would be very hard in Iceland, because the buildings are made of wood and turf and so on and so forth. We do hear about tapestries, and we know that there were some nice tapestries, but it really seems the case that these Moldager, they go through and they list the dedication, they list the lands, chalices and stuff like that. And then there are Líkneski and Skrift. And it's very difficult to know what they're actually talking about. My feeling is that a lot of those scripts are also statues. But I chose the word image as neutral so that I couldn't be, accused of mixing categories when I didn't really know what they were. So.
Yes, thank you for that. Please, if you have questions, do jump in, but I'm going to ask a follow-up quick question. Is there any mention of relics in these Moldager?
Yes. There are mentions of relics, and we never know whose relic. It is extremely frustrating. We know of, and we don't know them because of the Moldager. We know them because of narratives. We know that there were relics of St. Martin at Hólar. A couple of St. Olaf's relics. I can't remember exactly where. The major relics would probably have been the relics of the two Icelandic saints, Thorlákur and Jón. And remember the possibility of secondary relics. We don't know what they are. Once we're told that there's a little pouch, a little bursa, up on the altar containing dust from the shrine of Thorlákur or someone. And that was their relic. So, and there are also extremely frustrating to me entries that says shrine. Okay, there was a shrine, fine, 2 shrines, shrine with relics. Now, I have one colleague who insists that if there is a shrine, it must have relics in it. But I found myself thinking, no, if that were the case, you would not have to specify that some of them have relics, because presumably the other ones do not. So yes, there are relics, and the 3rd Icelandic holy man, Guðmundur Arason, who is, by the way, involved in the translations of both Jón and Thorlákur. He goes around with relics, and this is considered something very new and innovative. The saga comments on, and he did many things that no one had ever seen in Iceland before. And going around with relics and blessing things seems to have been one of the things that he did, and this would have been in the very early 13th century.
Thank you. Please, if you do have questions, you can raise your hand or write in the chat, and we can read it.
Wave.
No, yes, yes. I know Dan is really excited for his questions. Dan, please.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. This was illuminating. I have a series of curiosities. One of them would be from the beginning of your paper. You mentioned that anybody could do a baptism more or less, but to be a legitimate priest, you would need to know Latin. So what time was this again? And how much Latin did they have to know in order to make the threshold of legitimation?
Okay, we do actually have somewhere, and I can't remember, I need to track down where it shows up. It says that to know Latin well, basically you need to be able to know the gender of words. If you mix up the genders, then your Latin is not good enough. Now, that said, there are big arguments about how Latinate the clergy was in Iceland early on. And obviously there were some, who were as good as anywhere else. But they were the exceptions. And in fact, in Iceland, as elsewhere in Europe, to be a parish priest, you have to know enough Latin to do the Mass. And that's it. You don't really have to know more than that. And if you are expecting to give a homily, maybe you have a homily book in your own language. So they do not expect priests to be able to, translate Latin homilies into the vernacular. So the bar is pretty low for ordinary priests, but that said, there were people who composed in Latin, and the lives of the 2 Icelandic saints obviously had to be written in Latin, from the get-go. They then very soon got translated into the vernacular, so we have those. What else? No evidence for knowledge of Irish, just in case. And that's just kind of off to the side, because that's a big issue. If there were a bunch of Icelanders in the audience, that's what they would have wanted to know. But what about Irish? And the answer is a few words here and there, some personal names and so on, but no evidence. Yeah, and some folklore which could have come at any time. But no evidence for knowledge of Irish language. An awareness that Irish handwriting is different. You see that here and there. But the point is, you have these quote unquote Armenian bishops who apparently show up in Iceland. And that is, although it would have been the same if they had been Russian or Greek or whatever bishops. And the church law just says basically that you have to, church services are only legitimate if they're in Latin. Now, the bit about baptism, one of the very first things it says in the church law is that everybody has to be baptized, and all male persons should learn the words for baptism. If they don't know them, a woman can tell them what to say. If there's no male around, she can do it herself. You're even allowed early enough. You can melt snow, and they say melt it. Don't put the cold snow on the baby's head. And you're even at the earliest stage allowed to use spittle, but that eventually stops. But it's just absolutely essential to get those children baptized, because we all know what happens to non-baptized children, right? They go to hell, and that's not good.
Very,
So
very interesting.
anyone can in fact baptize. So even somebody who claims to be a bishop, but in the Orthodox Church can baptize, but so can a woman. So that doesn't mean anything.
No, thank you. Very interesting.
So
I'm happy to follow up if nobody jumps in.
Hi, I'm Margaret. I'm Janet. I teach in the Religious Studies Department at the University of Virginia. I don't think we've ever met.
I don't think so, no. I was
but
at the College of Charleston.
Right, yeah, it's really nice
Yeah,
to meet you.
yeah.
I know your work because I have a colleague who teaches Old Norse in the English department who's interested in this material.
No, wait a minute, that's Shut. What's her name?
No, well, this is actually
No.
Stephen Hopkins.
Stephen Hopkins. Okay. I'm thinking of somebody else who actually graduated from there and is now
There could be.
Okay, never mind. Yeah.
In any case, so I have two questions now. My first question is about the Armenian bishops.
Yes.
When were there supposedly Armenian bishops, and would this be like the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, like that moment?
Oh, okay. Wait. So as I said, let me find my screen again. As I said to Dan, I have PowerPoint. Okay, now where did the share go? It was up near the top, yes?
Are you planning to share something, or it's not coming
Yeah, I
across
want to
yet?
share my screen again.
Yes, please.
Okay, wait a minute. So where was that little icon? I can't find it.
It's in the middle of the bottom.
Oh, wait a minute. Okay, I've got the microphone. Sorry.
More to the right. It should be participants, chat, react, and share.
Okay, oh, there we go. Okay, hang on. Share. Okay, and now I need to
choose the window that you want to share.
Yes. Okay, and now I want to go down. Okay. So Árni Fróði, this is our very earliest sort of piece of historical writing, and what it's really interested in is chronology. Okay, so I just tell you that because people often think it's supposed to be some huge fat history book, and it isn't. It's just chronology. So the Book of the Icelanders translates Sean Grunley. This is also on the Viking Society webpage. It can be written down. So these are the names of the bishops. Friðrik came here during heathendom. Bjarnharður, the book learned, called Rodolf, Heinrich. In addition, 5 others came who called themselves bishops, and Ari isn't sure of this at all. Ornolfur and Godiskalk, and 3 Ernskir. Peter and Abraham and Stephanos. Now, the catch about that word Ernskir is it is the word which would normally use to be translated Armenia. But Armenia seems way too far away. And it has been also suggested that this is a place called Ermland, which is now Warmia in Poland on the Baltic coast. Okay, so we really, it's ambiguous just in the same way as the words for Greek, so Griskur and Gardskar. You can easily mix up those 2 words, and that's a difference between Russian and Greek. So Byzantium versus Kiev or Novgorod. So this is all highly problematic. And, oh dear. Okay, there is the law if they have been, so this is about if bishops are present, you see, I put them in parentheses here, if they are Armenian or Russian, whatever, Ermsker or Gresker, it is lawful for people to hear their services if they wish, but they are not to be paid for services, etc., etc., etc. And if you get them to do something that a Latin bishop is supposed to do, then you owe a fine to the bishop, and so on. And so now for the translators of this, they were the ones who put the quotation marks about Armenian and said that if they were in fact from Ermland, the language would have been Old Church Slavonic. And I would love it if there was someone in the audience there who can tell me exactly what the religious status was up there on the Baltic coast in the 11th century. I mean, was there anyone who could be sending out bishops from there, or even missionaries, never mind bishops? And what this second source says, and I was hunting up the original of this, but couldn't find it. Bishops came from other countries. They practiced greater leniency. So wicked men liked them better. Then Archbishop Adalbert sent a letter forbidding people to accept ministrations for them and said some of them were excommunicated and all of them had come without his permission. Now, if you look back at the names, there's, okay, Ornolver and Godeskalker, those are German names. So if these are some kind of people from Ermland rather than Armenia, they might have been there along with these, with some Germans sort of going as a group. And we just do not know. Okay. So I would, yeah. Now, what?
I'm sorry.
Okay, I always went for the Armenians, and where have I put it? Okay, so here's the bibliography for this. I actually wrote an article about this because in 1986, there was a little convent in Passau which had a local folktale about an Armenian bishop being buried there, which of course nobody believed. I mean, why would there be an Armenian bishop buried in this little tiny convent in Passau? But lo and behold, they were doing renovations and they dug up this grave in which there is somebody with a crozier and with a little metal plaque identifying him as, in fact, an Armenian bishop from the right period. So, if you can have an Armenian bishop in Passau, why can't you have Armenian bishops in Iceland? And if anybody knows anything more that has been written about that particular excavation, which is now 40 years old, I would love to know about that too. I did not go hunting around for it for this talk. But now with the internet, who knows what's possible to find.
So that's super interesting. And I'm also on Team Armenia here. I very much hope it's an Armenian in Iceland. Yeah. But I have one other question, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
So I'm just curious, which other saints are popular in Iceland? So you mentioned Catherine, I think, and along with Nicholas and Mary. I would have guessed Andrew, maybe. I'm just sort of curious which of these are particularly popular.
Okay, so I do not have my book at hand, but essentially Mary is number one. And what I'm counting here is now dedications, images, and books. So anything in any sort of physical, material culture in a church. We do have some calendars, but obviously there are more calendar saints than the saints that normal people are aware of. And the sort of top ones are Thorlakur, Olaf of Norway, Peter, Nicholas. I have the feeling I'm leaving somebody out. I'm not sure. I can scan the page and send it to you. And those are all people with sort of, 90 pieces of evidence or above. John the Baptist and John the Evangelist then are the next bunch. And there may be 70 of those. And then you have, people like Clement with sort of, up to half a dozen and not much more, sort of under 20 attestations. And the female, so the virgin martyrs appear to become popular after about 1200. So we have this very convenient cutoff at 1200 because that is when Thorlákur becomes the Icelanders' native saint, and his cult takes off like wildfire. So if there's a church that's dedicated to Saint Thorlákur and somebody else, you can figure that dedication postdates 1200. But hard and fast dates are very hard to come by. So. And there's one saint who was actually forbidden by the Bishop of Bergen, I think, Margaret of Nordnes. Okay, if you know your Scottish or Scandinavian history, you may have heard of the Maid of Norway who was lost at sea. She was a princess going to be married in Scotland, and the ship went down. Well, 20 years later, somebody shows up and claims to be her. And it is decided that she is not. She is burned at the stake. But the people who thought she was real say, okay, she was a saint. And so we have a very, very small but real cult of Margaret of Nordnes. And there's one statue of her in Iceland.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Margaret. Do we have more questions, thoughts, comments from the audience? I know Dan is dying to ask another question.
Okay.
But please, Dan, go ahead.
I think Andy raised a hand.
Is my mic working? Yes.
Yes.
Just something very much out there, which I was just thinking of, because in the recognitions, there's also this focus on the shipwreck. And I can imagine that seafaring is rather important in Iceland as well. Is there these kind of themes, how are they treated in this kind of literature? Is there anything different than what we would find in the other traditions?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the Iceland and rarely do you hear of someone discussed as the patron saint of X in Iceland. The only example of anything like it doesn't even mention a saint is women in childbirth are more likely to call on saints for help than anybody else, but it doesn't even mention which saints it might be. So I would say that the big saint for a variety of things is Nicholas, because he is one of the really popular ones. And although he was already known and venerated in Germany quite early on, thanks to Theophanu, when his relics are translated to Bari, of course, his cult gets a huge boost. And but it could very well be because of seafaring connections as well.
Okay.
And the thing is, saints are not necessarily, I mean, we like to think of saints as specialists, but medieval people didn't necessarily do so. I mean, if you have a guild, that's one thing, but there don't seem to be any guilds in Iceland. And, you call on whatever saint you think might be willing to listen at that particular time or place. So there are several cases of people who are lost at sea or whatever, and they call on Saint Thorlák. And we wouldn't otherwise know this, but he is one, because he's a local saint. We have a collection of his miracles. So we know that he's called on for all kinds of things, including a number of seafaring things. And including, there's one case in which he's called on, I hope I am remembering this right, but it's by somebody who was going to be Bishop of Hólar, and the patron of Hólar is the Virgin Mary. So you might think he would be calling on her, but no, he calls on Saint Thorlák.
Okay. Can I just because the Armenians were mentioned before,
Yes.
it reminded me also of this because you have other examples of this sort of traditions about bishops, well, being Armenian or claiming to be Armenian in this period, turning up in Western Europe. There's an example from Flanders as well, which was
Yes,
very buried in Ghent, where it's sort of Macarius, I think it is, claiming to be from Armenia, whether that's the case or not. So, I mean, it's and certainly because of trade. I mean, wouldn't be surprised. Certainly, they were well known. But if it's actually a case of Iceland, I don't know. Just something I wanted to add. Thanks very
Well,
much.
I would love to get up-to-date information about what Armenians were doing where and when in the Middle Ages. Because people, I mean, I started by saying this myself. Iceland is in the back of beyond, but Iceland has good connections with Europe. I mean, there are people going, on pilgrimage to Rome all the time, up and down the Rhine.
Yeah. No, and if there's trade connections, these kind of things also, then I mean, because certainly in Western Europe, we know of Armenians being in Bruges also because of trade coming from Cilician Armenia. So I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if for some reason one of them or a group of them ended up in Iceland for some reason. Yeah. No. Thanks.
Árni's problem is not that they're Armenians; they claim to be bishops, and he's just not. If you're a bishop, you would not be with a group of merchants, probably.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
I don't know. And these guys, and again, the problem for the subsequent problem is, okay, they claim to be bishops and so on and so forth. Does that mean we can get our church services and things from them? And the Grau says absolutely not. And that would have gone for Greek Orthodox equally well, or Old Church Slavonic or whatever, or Paulicians. So the very first suggestion about the Armenians was that they were Paulician heretics.
Who suggested this?
Who are supposedly from Armenia, and it's unclear to me exactly what their heresy was. So I kind of never, I never took that one particularly seriously.
Was that a scholar who suggested this or the source?
Yes, it was. It was somebody who evidently knew his heresies.
Yeah. No, this is a popular claim. Yeah, I wouldn't take that one very seriously, I think. But it's interesting. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Dan, do you want to jump in? We have 2 minutes.
Oh, I'll be very short. I'm curious. So the edition of the Saga of Clement is based on one manuscript, the old one that you showed us, and but you mentioned that. So we lost Latin manuscripts there, but we have vernaculars a lot. Is that the case? The literature on the various redactions of. Actually, I'm interested if Clement generated more literature in Icelandic. So if there are other manuscripts where fragments and bits and pieces, and in a second question, if in that context is also see Clement as the author of ecclesiastical legalistic sort of works as we see in other parts as well.
Okay, I did not hunt for homilies by Clement or anything like that. That would have been a whole separate thing, and I just didn't have time for it. I know who to ask, however, and I will do that. But for Clement himself, for his saga, we just have those two manuscripts. That said, we have a lot of manuscripts about St. Peter. And it is my understanding, I think I've got this right, that there is a saga about St. Peter which uses the old Clemens saga and is in its turn used by the younger Clemens saga. So you actually get the impression with some of these things that you have people and they've got maybe 3 or 4 manuscripts in different languages, in Latin or Icelandic in front of them, and they're trying to piece together a story. And they take one sort of as far as it will go, but then there's something that doesn't seem to be quite right, so they borrow it from somewhere else, or they finesse it themselves. But the Petrine material is huge. So, but Hoffman looked at it. So you're
I know
in
the book.
Canada, you
I
must
know
have
where to
children,
look.
so you can, answer all the questions as far as he knew, and that's as far as I know, from there.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Margaret, for this wonderful paper and this one conversation. And to all who joined us this afternoon, thank you very much. Afternoon, morning, your time. Thank you very much for joining us. We do have a paper next month too, so hope to see you there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.